As Dharma Dasan was saying last night, we have entered the center of the mandala. So we've been going through the mandalas of the jhinas, the 5 jhinas and their 5 mudras. And the mudras are very important. We're not really going through the Buddha figures themselves necessarily, not directly, but I really wanted us to focus on the mudras. I was sort of using the mandala of the 5 Buddhas as the key 5 mudras that the Buddha shows. And I think they're very important because they're kind of what enlightenment looked, or the facets of the enlightened experience manifested bodily. And it's almost like that particular quality of enlightenment just has to come out physically. So we've been looking at the mudra of touching the earth. We've been looking at the mudra of generosity, the mudra of meditation. The mudra of fearlessness was the last one. And now we've got to the mudra of teaching the Dharma. And in a funny kind of way, I was doing this last night to myself in my bedroom, and I was thinking in some ways this is the union of all the mudras. I don't know if I can say more about that, but it is well, maybe you'll see. So what I thought you could do is we could all do the mudra. Now, if you're shy to do that, you could turn off your camera. That's the advantage of being on Zoom. But I hope, you know, we can all do the mudra. So if you remember, it's 2 circles with your fingers splayed out and then to your heart. Camera a bit down. So trying to get that mudra, and then and this is the difficult bit, try to relax the shoulders, particularly. Sort of very easy with this one to kind of do it like that. And just feel it. Just feel it. That circle should be kind of over your heart center. So just feeling what that mudra feels like at the heart center. Allow it to take its shape. Allow it to take its form. And it's not just a mudra of the fingers or the hands, it's a mudra of the whole body. So feeling its resonance in the body. Where can you feel it inside the body? What does it feel like inside the body to do that mudra? Feeling the circle of the thumbs and the index finger, feeling the fingers moving outwards. Feeling the resonance in the body. You can carry on doing that as long as you like, if you like. But I hope you get a sense that there's something very, very centered about it. It's coming from right in the heart. I don't know if you felt it, but I felt it right in the heart center. And in a way, speaking to my central channel, the energetic kind of flow in the center of the body, that kind of point of stability in the center of the body. And I don't think that's an accident. I think it's in a way that communicates it all, coming from the center of the body, right into, from the heart center, and then also radiating out in all directions, or at least as many directions as your fingers can point to. So, yeah, it represents the wheel of the Dharma. So that kind of mudra is a wheel. And the wheel of the Dharma is a pre-Buddhist image, actually. It seems it's a pre-Buddhist image. And it used to refer to the wheel-turning king, the Chakravartin. Because if you were a true king, who was a good king, who looked after their subjects, apparently on the palace would be this great big, would appear a great perfect wheel with 1,000 spokes. But if you failed in your duties as a wheel-turning king, the wheel would fall. And there's quite a long story about that in the long discourses, the Digha Nikaya in the Pali Canon. Interestingly, it starts to slip off its pedestal when you stop looking after the poorest in society. Because when you stop looking after the poorest in society and inequality in society becomes more pronounced, then people will have to resort to unethical action in order to feed themselves. So the more inequality you have in society, the wheel starts to slip off its pedestal and crashes to the ground. And it said, you know, when the Buddha was born, he was predicted either to become a wheel-turning monarch, a wheel-turning king, or a wheel-turning Buddha. So the Buddha was always going to be extraordinary, but there's that juxtaposition of, would he take worldly power and worldly success, or would he take spiritual success and spiritual perfection? It was also a sign that he wasn't going to be the kind of holy person who kept his knowledge to himself, that knowledge that he gained would be spread throughout the earth. So the wheel of the Dharma represents knowing the truth. That's that central circle of the wheel, and then spreading the truth. And that's the fingers. So it's not only that the Buddha knew the truth, he understood the truth, he saw into the truth, but that he also communicated that truth very widely. He had a certain number of, in a way, worldly advantages that helped that process. One of them was that he was very well trained. He was brought up in a princely family. He was very well educated. It also said it helped to some degree that he was extremely handsome. And there are various stories about that. So the mudra itself suggests harmony, it suggests movement, it suggests radiation, it suggests a kind of order to things coming from a central point and radiating out. It sort of reminds me of, there's a poem about how when society breaks down by Yeats, where he says, just thought of this, so I'm quoting it from memory, but turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. You know, there's a suggestion there that when society breaks down, that central point, that radiation from a central point is lost, and there's chaos. And this image of the falcon cannot hear the falconer. There's no communication between the center of the mandala and the edges, if you see what I mean. Anyway, that just occurred to me. And we've got this story from the Buddha. We've got this very, very moving story, which I think is worth reflecting on again and again and again. So we know the story of the Buddha. He spent his life so far searching for the truth, finding different religious practices in order to understand the truth. And so much energy, so much dedication has gone into that search. And he gains enlightenment, and he said, the text said, he sits for 7 weeks under various trees in the what's now the Bodh Gaya complex, but at that time was a small wood or copse. So he's there for 7 weeks absorbing what's happened. It's not that enlightenment just happens and then he gets up and thinks, right, well, that's job done. The implications of that momentous revolution of consciousness takes time to permeate through his whole being. And in that time, when he's sitting absorbing the bliss of liberation, he has a reticence to teach. There's a little impulse outwards. And he thinks, no one will understand. It's subtle, it's deep. You can't understand it by reason. How will anyone understand in this world where beings died with craving and blinded and in darkness? How will anyone understand? So you can really feel that in the text. Here he is. He's finally understood. He's finally got there. Sangharakshita describes it as being like a great waterfall, all this energy just pouring into liberation. And here he is just pouring into liberation, feeling that liberation. And there's a subtle movement outwards. And in that movement outwards towards others, there's a doubt. And there's a reticence, what they call the reticence to teach. He pulls back very, very subtly. And he thinks that people won't understand. And at that point, Brahma Sahampati appears and begs him to teach. So Brahma Sahampati really symbolizing the world itself at this point, the kind of highest deva in the world. He's usually depicted a bit like an elderly man with a long beard. But I don't know if that's how they originally depicted it or whether we just projected our sort of image of God onto Brahma Sahampati. I've not seen him myself, so I don't know what he looks like. But that's the image, is the world comes to beg the Buddha to teach. And at that point, he has a vision of lotuses. He has a vision that all beings are like lotuses emerging from the mud of existence. They're all stretching towards the light, towards space, towards growth, towards the blue sky. And we're all trying to kind of make our way. The Buddha really felt this. And he felt this, as said, he then had compassion for all beings. But the word you may well know is anukampa. And anukampa literally means trembling or shaking. He shook with the world. It reminds me of an episode towards the end of his life where he turns to the monks. He's asked to see the monks and he's checking that they understand the Dharma. He knows that he's going to die and he wants to make sure that they understand the most essential teachings. And he's there with Ananda and he looks across the crowd and he said, it's through not understanding, through not penetrating the Four Noble Truths that we've run on and wandered round this long, long journey, both you and I. So there's a real sense in that, a kind of tenderness that he has understood, and he can see that it's through not understanding that we suffer, and that him included, we've all been on this process of lifetimes and lifetimes searching for the truth. And I think that's the feeling in him that shakes with others. So just as he has understood it, he must communicate it. So he brings to mind his old teachers, and with the mind of the Buddha, he can see that they've died. And then he reflects on his own old companions in the spiritual life, who he's left because he doesn't think the practices they're undergoing work. So they are having ascetic practices. He doesn't think that's actually the way to enlightenment. But he remembers them at that point, and out of gratitude, he thinks, well, maybe they will understand. You know, they've helped me before. We were on this spiritual journey together. I'll go to them. They might understand. And he gets up and he walks quite a long way, actually. He's walking from what's now Bodh Gaya to what's now Sarnath. To give you some perspective, it's now got a dual carriageway between it. and it takes about 4 hours in Indian driving, which I noticed meant if the other side of the dual carriageway is clear, let's just go the opposite direction, which is utterly terrifying if you're British. But anyway, it takes about 4 hours. So it took him a long time. I mean, traditionally, he gained enlightenment in the full moon of May, and he taught the Dharma on the full moon of July. So, but he had a long time sitting under the tree. Anyway, he got up and walked, which Dr. Ambedkar said was very unusual. He made the point, this is very unusual because most holy men, sannyasins or sadhus, they would wait for disciples to come to them. They would sit, he would remain seated under the tree and wait for disciples to come to him. But the Buddha didn't. He decided to walk, which is why we, in our movement, we have a lot of rupas of the walking Buddha, not just the seated Buddha. So the London Buddhist Centre and Nagaloka, you'll find great big statues of the walking Buddha. And he's got this beautiful phrase, which is, open for them are the doors to the deathless. He will teach the Dharma. Open for them are the doors to the deathless. So I think it's important, because this story, to sort of feel our way into that movement within enlightenment itself, which is a movement outwards, that within the enlightenment experience itself, there's a movement outwards to share. And the significance of Brahma Sampati coming is that he also says this is always the way it is. This is always the way it is. With any Buddha of any world system, they always have a moment. They always have this impulse to teach, and then a moment where they draw back, and then a vision of humanity as being at various stages of development, but with the potential to understand the Dharma. And because there's the potential to understand the Dharma, in a way, it must be taught, it must be communicated. There's a really beautiful passage. It's one of Sangharakshita's sort of very strange, sometimes he has in a lecture, a very strange passage, which he doesn't really explain. It's almost like he's kind of opened it out, and then it's up to you what you make of it. But in his lecture called The Case of Dysentery, the most inspiring title, but it is worth listening. A very mysterious passage, which is, there exists within the enlightenment experience, within the heart of reality, an element of communication, an element of spiritual friendship, something that found expression in the later history of Buddhist thought as that rather mysterious concept of Sambhogakaya, which literally means the body of mutual enjoyment. So there exists within the heart of reality an element of communication and spiritual friendship. That's a very, very important thing to reflect on, because we usually understand enlightenment and liberation itself as being a solitary affair, as being, you know, we imagine insight to be something that happens within our own sort of sphere of consciousness without being affected or without affecting anyone else. Particularly in this culture where, just as we have here, you can sort of see you've got the Buddha behind you. We tend to think of the Buddha as a kind of solitary figure. And we have one rupa on our shrines. Actually, we've got Pranya Paramita, who you may not see that closely, but she's also in the wheel-turning mudra. And the Buddha, and above him, the refuge tree. In traditional Asian cultures, in traditional Buddhist cultures, you don't really have the Buddha on his own. You have the Buddha with his disciples, or with usually Padmapani and Vajrapani, or something along those lines. You'll have the Buddhas and the Bodhisattvas, or the Buddhas and Buddha and his disciples, because enlightenment is not a one-sided affair. It's not really just about one's own consciousness, because of course it's not contained. It contains, it's not contained within our own sort of mind. Enlightenment itself is a vision of how we're not separate and isolated. how we're not fixed, how we're always in relationship, and the true profundity of always being in relationship with others. It's so deep, that relationship, that it's not a relationship between fixed entities. You know, it's like when I imagine sort of my relationships with others, I imagine myself and my friends as kind of fixed entities who like each other or don't on occasion. But it's not really like that. It's not a relationship between entities, but almost like energetic resonances. It's a relationship between non-fixed, non-separate flows of conditions. That's all you sort of language breaks down, but I hope you get an idea of what I'm saying, that the Buddha himself saw his absolute relatedness, which meant him giving up the idea of a fixed and separate selfhood in relationship with other fixed and separate selfhoods. It was much, much more profound than that, in a way that's very, very hard to put into language. It is just relationship. It is just movement, not relationship between fixed people or fixed things. And there's a responsiveness to that. I think this is what this episode in the life of Buddha is showing us. There's a responsiveness to realizing our profound relationships with others, the deep, deep realization that fundamentally we are not alone and we could have never been alone. There was no possibility of that at any point. And that's symbolized by this mudra, that responsiveness to that. The bliss of liberation and the movement of that bliss of liberation towards all beings. And of course, that's true of the sort of, in its ultimate sense, in the realization of enlightenment itself. But I think it's not just enlightenment. I think we realize that to some level at all stages of our Dharma life, at all levels of our Dharma life. We realize that we can't do it alone, and that we must, there's this kind of impulse, this movement to share one's Dharma life. I think that's very natural. It's natural because it's in line with reality. That we have to share ourselves and share our Dharma life, that it's not just confined to us. It's there all the time. Those depths of connection in some ways are there all the time, this realization that we aren't fixed or separate, isolated entities. That's true all the time. And I think as we deepen our Dharma life and we deepen our Dharma practice, we start to take that on more and more. The Dharma life has to be shared. And there's all sorts of stories about that in the Buddhist tradition, you know, from the Buddha himself. And well, I won't go through the whole story again because I say it so often, but this story that I love so much of the Buddha calling out Ananda simply to rejoice in the merits of Sariputta. How wonderful. He didn't need to do that. He didn't need to he wasn't making a big Dharma talk. He just sometimes wanted to rejoice in his disciples. And we have that from other Dharma teachers, where there's just an impulse to share one's feeling about the Dharma, to share one's practice about the Dharma. I often read the life story of Yeshe Sogyal, and there's these wonderful kind of songs where she just goes to visit Padmasambhava's other disciples. And there's no particular reason for it. She just decides that she wants to go and visit another disciple of Padmasambhava, and she wants to talk to them about her practice of the Dharma and hear what they've been practicing. And they have these verses together that are like, I imagine them like kind of songs. They're just singing together and rejoicing in each other's practice. It seems to be a very, very integral part of the Dharma life. And of course it is, because fundamentally we're not alone, and fundamentally we are related to others. So there's this movement within the richness of our Dharma life that wants to be shared at all levels. But of course, sometimes it's a bit difficult to know how to share our Dharma life. Sometimes we can be a little bit nervous. We can feel like we might overshare and someone might take that badly, or not receive it well, that maybe they'll start criticizing us, or that it won't be enough, or we'll embarrass ourselves. Sometimes we get concerned that we're going to fix that experience, or by talking about our experience of the Dharma, we might sort of, well, in a way, sort of sully it in some way. We might try, it comes out and it's fixed and it's not quite what we meant. You know, there's a transition from our depths and our inner Dharma life into words that doesn't quite do it justice. Sometimes that's quite painful. Sometimes we just don't know how to share, or what conditions have we got in order to share. But yeah, and sometimes it can be extremely painful. But I'm afraid to say that it's in line with the nature of reality that, painful as it is, we must share. We don't actually have a choice. It's not that we can keep our Dharma practice to ourselves. That's not actually a possibility. So we're going to have to find a way to share it with each other in a way that honors that experience and deepens that experience. And it doesn't mean just talking. It can mean talking. And I think, you know, that is the primary method of human communication. But it's also, one can communicate in songs. There's a wonderful chapter, if you're ever a bit bored or just want a fun chapter to read of the Samyutta Nikaya. So maybe people don't do this kind of thing, but I think it's a good thing to do. If you're here on retreat, we've got a copy, but you might find it online. Anyway, there's the Samyutta Nikaya, is the connected discourses. So it's all the collections of particular stories from the Buddha, or particular interactions. And there's one section on Vangisa, which is who's a singer. And it's all the Buddha's interaction with Vangisa, so this singer. And basically what happens is something goes on, and Vangisa gets terribly excited and stands up and says, I feel inspired to sing a song. And the Buddha says, yeah, go ahead, great. And there's some really sweet, and they're usually sort of rejoicings or quite worldly in a way, sort of songs about his own Dharma life, his own journey towards the Dharma life, and or he's rejoicing in the disciples of the Buddha, or the Buddha himself. And sometimes the Buddha, you can see he's sort of reading between the lines. He's really enjoying himself. And he sometimes just says, oh, have you got any more inspired utterances that you'd like to share with us? Any more songs? And Vangisa says, oh, yes, I think I can. He said, oh, yes, go ahead. No, carry on. So you can imagine the Buddha just loved that. He just loved that communication. They all sit around and listen to Vangisa's beautiful songs. You can see that Vangisa was quite a romantic, and sometimes he sings about his old loves, which is very sweet. So yeah, we have to share in songs, in art or poetry. I've just received actually in the post a wonderful, wonderful thing, which is Dayanandi made this pledge to T. Ratnaloka Unlimited to do a painting every day, or a picture or a drawing every day. And she wrote up a diary as she was doing it, and that's now produced. I think Tara Vandana is going to get her copy and show it in her screen. It's the most wonderful book. And in a way, I feel like, I feel kind of gripped by it, because I feel like I've known Dayanandi since my first retreat at Tara Loco, and I was about, I don't know, 20 or something. But I feel like I've got a glimpse of her inner workings. It's absolutely beautiful. So there's different ways that we communicate our practice of the Dharma. Sometimes we think it has to be a formal Dharma talk, and sometimes we do need to do that. It's true, we do need to do that. But sometimes we just need to just communicate in any way. It doesn't have to be confined to a Dharma talk, not just teaching in the formal sense. I suppose the principle is, I remember one of the last things that Sangharakshita ever said to me is he said, you know, order members make the mistake that they think it's enough to tend to their own garden. But actually what we're trying to do is we're trying to create a garden for all of us, between all of us, a mutual garden, a garden of mutual understanding, delight, and sharing of the Dharma life. And Sangharakshita described that as a garden in the wilderness that other people can join in and participate in and help cultivate themselves. So that's what the Dharma life is. In a way, we're creating a culture, we're creating an atmosphere, we're creating a culture of mutual sharing where we can all flourish and flourish on the basis of the Dharma. So one of the, I'm drawing a lot of this. In the next part, I'll be a bit more about how we do this. But just to say, I'm drawing a lot of it from a talk that Bhante gave called Communicating the Dharma, which is 15 points for giving Dharma talks, basically. So if you are involved in giving Dharma talks, formal Dharma talks, or you'd like to be, to whatever extent that you do that, I really recommend listening to those 15 points. It's quite funny as well. At one point, Bhante is clearly doing an impression of an unmindful order member, which is only recorded audibly, so you don't know what that impression is, but I have my kind of imagination. He was a bit, could tease sometimes a little bit, Sangharakshita. Anyway, so one of the points he makes in that, he says that, we've got to make sure it's actually the Dharma that we're communicating. So if we're going to create this kind of garden of the Dharma where everyone shares in the Dharma, we've got to make sure it is actually the Dharma that they're sharing. So the first principle of creating this garden is to make sure it's imbued with our practice of the Dharma, that's what we're communicating is the practice of the Dharma, our practice of the Dharma. There's a big emphasis in today's culture, and I think even more so since Sangharakshita gave that talk, which I think was in 1999. There's a big emphasis in our culture, which is about being yourself. Being yourself, which is I always found that I find that very vague. I remember I found it very vague when I was in my 20s and I was being asked by sort of society's norms to be myself. But I was thinking, like, which self? Because sometimes, like, I'm really depressed and I don't think it's necessarily a good idea just to always communicate from that self. And I can also see that self kind of moves through, if you see what I mean, with the right sort of love and awareness. So it's not denying that, but it's also what self am I? I think I was really quite confused, particularly in my 20s, about what self am I meant to be? Because there's lots of different pulls, there's lots of different competing selves, there's lots of different kind of pulls within my being. And some of them are really, really quite unskillful. So all these competing selves want to look in. What Sangharakshita is saying is actually what we're trying to communicate is the self that's really involved with deep Dharma practice, which doesn't have to be a particular way for any one person, but to communicate the Dharma and our practice of the Dharma itself, even if that's communicating how we're working with the hindrances, for example, or doubt or anything like that. Otherwise, what we do is when we talk about being ourselves, we just fix our identity on what's most familiar to us. And or uppermost at that moment. So I can understand the point of be yourself, because I can understand the point of being yourself is to not try and pretend to be someone else or to not deny one's own sort of shadow side. I can definitely see that, the importance of that. But in sharing the Dharma life, we're trying to do something a little bit different. We're trying to communicate our practice of the Dharma, even if it's practice of the Dharma through quite difficult mental states. And we really have to be careful about this because we live in the age of narcissism. I think who was it? It's Alan Watts he was writing, I think, in the 60s, and he was saying that he thought it was the age of anxiety. And I think it is the age of anxiety, but it's rapidly moving into the age of narcissism, where every experience is reflected on as, how does this make me look? So even going around an art gallery the other day, I went to the Tate Modern with my tray, and what I could see is people don't just look at art anymore. They will sort of want to have it in some way. So what they do is they don't even just take a photo of the art. They take a photo of themselves looking at the picture. I've never seen that before. That's a new thing. So, I mean, I could understand it. Sometimes I want to take a picture of the painting itself because I sort of want to reflect on it, even though the picture of the picture on a mobile phone of a painting is never going to be that painting. It's almost like I kind of want a reminder. So I can sort of see that. But taking a picture of ourselves in front of the painting, and it means that there's a kind of barrier between the painting and us in terms of actually looking at the painting. So what I was seeing was people weren't actually looking at the artwork, not for any kind of depth or substantial amount of time. They were just there to take a picture of themselves in front of the artwork. And I find that really sad because in a way we lose something. What we lose is the ability to actually enter the world of a painting. And to see what that's communicating and what even the state of the artist is behind the production of that painting. The painting is a communication. Say it's a painting, it could be anything, particularly at Tate Modern. But that artwork is a communication from the artist about something. So to take another example, if you go into the Tate Britain and you go to the cloud room, I love the cloud room. It always just makes me feel so joyful. It's basically all Turner's notebooks of looking at clouds. And I think here is a man who spent a large part of his life studying the sky and clouds. And when he paints that, it's a communication of a lifetime of looking at clouds. And I personally want to know what he's got to say about the sky. I don't really want to see me in front of a picture. I want to hear his communication. He's taken that effort to communicate with me. Sometimes I might not even like the communication, but I want to know what that painting has to say, because often they communicate something about universal human value, and I respond to that. So I want to respond to that universal human value. I don't really just want to respond to me looking, you know, look, here I am at an art gallery. So yeah, there's a magic. We're going to lose a bit of magic. We're going to lose communication if it's just about our own kind of narcissism and how it makes us look. When Sangharakshita gave this talk, he talks about this Buddhist teacher. He says, I'm not going to mention any names. Anyway, he talks about this Buddhist teacher who goes on stage to give a Dharma talk, still shaving. And when he said that, everyone's kind of laughing, like, how ridiculous. And when he said that in the talk, I just thought, well, that's social media. You know, that tendency has carried on the whole time. So, you know, you get those little videos. There's a lot of now we do a lot of communication on short videos on Instagram or Facebook or other social media platforms. And I've been looking into this recently because I'm not very good at it. And I'm often asked to do it, and I'm not actually very good at it. So I've been kind of looking at them, and particularly from Buddhist centers, to see how they do, how we do them. And I am looking at Instagram and what's posted just generally in the world, on Instagram. And I thought, well, that would be typical. That would be like a Dharma teacher. I can just totally imagine it starting off a Dharma teaching or a short video about the Dharma shaving will be so classic for Instagram. And I think there's something terribly narcissistic about it. So Bante's really encouraging us. He just said, don't do that. Don't take that kind of informality to try and make a point, because it's about you. It stops being about the Dharma and it starts being about you. There's a kind of terrible tendency on social media to make it about my opinion about everything. And it's all then about us rather than about the Dharma itself. And I have to say that makes me slightly nervous, that culture, because then it's not the Dharma that's going to be communicated. It's going to be our sense of self-grasping, or our sense of grasping after an identity, or even an avatar, an impression of ourselves to make ourselves look good rather than the Dharma itself. And of course, then that will be the death of the Dharma. The Dharma should be slightly beyond ourselves. You know, it's our practice of it, but it should have this element of needing further reflection and further examination. And also, people do notice. So young people, particularly like what I call like properly young people, which is people in their early 20s and teens, have been absolutely saturated by meaningless, trivial, narcissistic social media. And a lot of them are saying they don't want it anymore. They're not stupid. A lot of people, young people in particular, are really questioning the need for that kind of trivialization of important points. And they're looking for something different in the Buddhist center. They want depth and experience and straightforwardness, straightforward Dharma teaching. I was just recently in London and I went to the Brixton class and I gave a talk, and a group of young people wanted to speak to me afterwards. And they were firing questions, and you could see very, very detailed questions with a lot of thought, a lot of integrity behind them. And they wanted to know what I was saying, and they wanted to know what the Dharma exactly says and what I thought about it in my experience. And what they wanted was my experience. They didn't want me to be down there with the kids. It's just embarrassing. You know, I'm 45. I know the fashion that was my fashion in the 90s has come back again, but it's a bit sad when it's the second time round. So, you know, I don't need to be that person. I don't need to be kind of young and speak the right language in that sort of sense. What they want is experience in sincerity and the Dharma itself, and then they can choose whether they want to follow it. I think actually in my explorations, I think the London Buddhist Centre has got some very good short videos, and particularly Maitreya Bandhu. And I was thinking, what is it that makes Maitreya Bandhu's videos good? And I think it's partly because they're not really about him. You don't have to like him to go to the London Buddhist Centre. You don't have to get a particular impression of Maitreya Bandhu through those videos. He's very clear. He's just saying what the class he's particularly advertising is about, what the kind of next steps are, what the kind of main point is that they'll be exploring. But they're not really about him personally, and I really appreciate that. So communicating the Dharma is communicating the Dharma as an alive tradition within us, keeping that tradition alive in the future, so that we're communicating the Dharma, not just as an abstract philosophy, but also not just as us and our own sort of unprocessed worldliness, if you see what I mean. I think some of the best advice that I've ever had for giving a Dharma talk was actually from Padma Vajra. And he just said to me at one point, he said, look, Vajratara, you don't have to make a special point. It's bread and butter Dharma. You just have to explain the Dharma itself. You don't have to make it kind of special or about you or put your own slant on it. There's absolutely nothing original that I say. It's all either the Buddha or Bhante's translation of the Buddha. It reminds me of this story where the Buddha turns to his disciples and he says, disciples, you are born of my breast, born of my mouth, heirs of Dharma, followers of Dharma, not heirs of material things. So we are inheriting the Dharma as the tradition that's come down from this particular Buddha for the last 2,500 years. And our job is to hand it down to the next generation in a way that's alive and vital. And that it's the Dharma being practiced, not just the latest social media trend. So how do we do that? Kind of, gosh, it's meant to be a bit quicker than this. Anyway, how do we do that? I'd like to just quickly look at the Sangharavastus. But we've all heard this list before, but just a few points for us to reflect on about each one. So the first, so Sangharavastus, as we know, means gathering or accumulating, particularly gathering a community around us. But in a way, we can look at the principles of communication. So the first is Dharma, to be generous with one's experience. So turning the wheel of the Dharma mudra is in contrast to what the Buddhist tradition calls the tight fist of a bad teacher. They often have this phrase, the tight fist of a bad teacher. And the principle is to share what we have been given with others, to make it possible for others what's been possible for us, and to share with each other the experiences that we've had, particularly, for example, one's study of the Dharma, one's reflections, meditation, retreat experiences. And not just to make a good impression or to show how far we've come in a kind of self-conscious way, but just because it invites openness, because it's a gift. You know, I was thinking about this and I was thinking, well, I never had heard of so many things when I came to the Buddhist Center, but then do you remember the excitement, or do you feel the excitement of when someone comes back from retreat, or particularly solitary retreats, and they talk to you about their retreats? And I remember thinking, like, what, you just go on your own in like some caravan in Wales somewhere and just meditate? You know, the idea was completely new to me, but I love to hear about people's solitary retreats and what they'd experienced there and what they'd done there. And how it had been for them, and how they'd worked with fear, and how they'd worked with boredom. So there's a generosity in just sharing what we've been given. So enabling classes to happen, enabling Buddhist centers and retreat centers to run, but also just communicating what our practice is and has been over the years. And part of that is that we need to reflect. We need to reflect on that experience deeply so that we can be clear. Buddhism is a very, very clear tradition. That's why it has sort of lists and a very clear structure in it, because it's an oral tradition, and oral traditions are communicated a lot of the time through lists, because you can remember the list and then you know how to talk about it. So in a way, we've got a very, very good structure within Buddhism to be able to reflect on our experience and communicate it. So yeah, so we have to reflect on that. We don't just have an experience, we reflect on that experience and we work out how to communicate it in line with the Dharma. And we do that out of gratitude, you know, looking back on all those people who enabled us to practice the Dharma. Who ran classes pretty much for free, you know, class teams, those people, not even necessarily order members, but those people who'd be at the classes just willing to talk to us. And, you know, there you are quite nervous. It's not just about you talking. I remember, you know, finding it so painful to think of something to say to order members or class team members when they came and talked to me at the South London Buddhist Centre all those years ago. And I remember that because I don't think it was good that if I had to wait to talk first, in a sense. It was actually really helpful when someone else talked first and they shared their experience. And they'd say, oh, how are you? And I'd say, yeah, fine, how are you? And they'd say, oh, well, I've just come back off retreat, or I've just been studying this, or I've really enjoyed my meditation today. It gave me a whole way of talking about my own experience that I really appreciate them leading that conversation. So, yeah, and I remember things like who welcomed me at my first class. And I remember, Sahaja Siddhi teaching me how to set up my meditation posture. And I remember Manasa saying to me one day, look, we're all going on retreat. Would you like to come? And would you like to come in the car? We're driving. And if you want, you can come with us and help set it up. So my first weekend retreat, I went with all the order members, and we got some things from Croydon Buddhist Centre, which I'd never been to before. On the way there down to Rivendell, I don't know, I just remember we sort of going to Croydon Buddhist Centre, picking some stuff up, going to Rivendell, and having this retreat. And I remember not really knowing who the Bodhisattva was, and dear old Kami Jyoti took me round the Rivendell shrine room and showed me all the Bodhisattva figures. All those things that people do for us, just sharing their inspiration, you know. And she told me about which figure that she liked the best, and her sadhana, and how she reflected on them, and all those things. And we both remember that years later. We both remember that. And that comes from gratitude that we would do that for others. And it also comes from love. One of the things Sangharakshita says in that lecture is, he says, it's also necessary to love your subject. I would even say that you should be in love with your subject. And it is out of the abundance of that love that you just want to talk. So when we love our subject, when we're clear about our subject, which is the Dharma in this case, and out of gratitude for all the people who did the same for us, we just share that. You share that openly. We mull it over in our mind, constantly turning it over out of love. And that love pours out, loving the Dharma, loving the practice of the Dharma, and allowing that to pour out into communication, because we want others to love it too. So there's dana, and then there's priyavadita, which is kindly speech. So this love pours out of us in kindly speech, but not just in terms of the words we use, although it's very important that we use kind of kindly words, but also in our beings ourselves, the way we are with people. So much is communicated, even if people are a bit clunky and they don't know the lists. That you're just able to communicate the Dharma with who you are, that openness of being, which is who you are. I think that's why class teams are so important. And sometimes it's really important that it's not just order members, because people who aren't ordained can provide a bridge between the person who's just coming along and someone who's ordained. But those people are very important because they communicate actually how the Dharma is practiced, that openness and that friendliness. Usually we don't really remember what we heard in the first Dharma talk or in the first Dharma class we've been to, but we do remember our interactions with others and the atmosphere of the Buddhist Center itself. And I think that requires of us a mindfulness of others, so that there's a mutual responsiveness. And I think this guards against this kind of narcissism. I think it's easier to be narcissistic on social media because you're not actually in communication with anyone. That's why I don't really like it myself, is because I have to feel in communication with people, even if it's on a sort of Zoom gallery screen. So, yeah, so it's really important to take other people in. The way that Sangharakshita talks about this is knowing your audience, knowing who you're speaking to. If you're giving a talk, look at people, and look at people when you're communicating with them. Some people are quite shy, some people are quite resonant, some people you see they've got a question brewing, and you're just giving them an atmosphere in which they can open up. But you're talking to an actual person. It's a communication between us, what Sangharakshita called the vital mutual responsiveness on the basis of a common ideal and a common principle. So in order for the mutual responsiveness to occur, we've got to have a real sense of the people that we're communicating with. And that's what makes it so exciting, because it isn't just you and your world and your solitary retreat. It's also how that interacts with another human being. So yes, it's very important to take other people in, to see if it's a bit like an animal, you know, you don't just walk directly up to a squirrel. And if you want to get communication from a squirrel, don't just go up to it head on. like, right, I'm going to talk to you, you know. It's also mutual responsiveness. You might have to just sit there and wait for the squirrel to come to you, which I've noticed in Victoria Park last week that they're quite keen to do, probably because they think you've got food. But anyway, I think the same sort of principle occurs. Sometimes you have to kind of draw people out, and sometimes you just wait. You just wait and let them come in their own time. So yes, so there's knowing who you're speaking to, taking time to get a sense of them in that mutual responsiveness, so that there is an opportunity for mutual responsiveness. And then there's artacharya, which is beneficial activity or meaningful activity. I think it's really important here that we get a sense that we're communicating out of respect for others and respect for ourselves. Really, the beneficial, the arta part of this comes from a sense of the vision of the potential of human beings, and that all beings have that potential, including ourselves. I think if I was going to give one piece of advice, particularly to people I've found in the ordination process, is that take yourself seriously. Take yourself more seriously than you can ever imagine taking yourself. And take other people seriously too. You know, we have an emphasis, particularly in our movement, on friendliness, and I think that's very important. But it's friendliness that comes from a vision of potentiality of each human being, and that each of us have got an existential longing, a search for truth within us that it's very important to cultivate. So really take yourself seriously. Don't, you know, you've been given the gift of the Dharma. You are heir of the Dharma, follower of the Dharma, not heirs of material things, born of the Buddha's mouth, born of his breast. And I think we've got to take that seriously. It's no good dumbing ourselves down. I think this is actually one of my working grounds, is that I can become overly informal. And I'm usually overly informal if it's more to do with my own self-consciousness and shyness, actually. But take yourself seriously. You've have the privilege to be born in a time when the Buddha's teachings are available, the means to liberation is available, and that is a very, very serious thing itself. There's a story about Purna, where in the Vimalakirti Nadesha, and Purna is a monk. There's lots of stories about Purna, but I'm focusing on the one in the Vimalakirti Nadesha. And Purna's a monk, and he's teaching the other monks the Dharma, and Vimalakirti comes along. You know Purna's in trouble when Vimalakirti comes along. Anyway, and he says, don't teach them that. He said, it's like putting rotten food into their bowl. He said, first, you've got to understand the intentions and the motivations of the people that you're talking to. And here the Sanskrit is ashaya, and ashaya means, in a way, that kind of existential urge, that deep motivation, that deep longing within the human psyche itself. And Vimalakirti says, don't try to pour the great ocean into the hoofprint of an ox. Don't confuse the brilliance of the sun with the light of a glowworm. Do not expose those who admire the roar of a lion to the howl of a jackal. And then he goes back and he talks to the monks themselves, and he teaches them a meditation where they can recall their own motivation, their own beautiful motivation, the Kalyana Ashaya. Their own, in a way, that kind of existential urge they have towards liberation. And they remember that in previous lives, they've served the Buddhas of old. And I really like that story, because I think what it behoves us to do is to see that you don't know where people are coming from. You don't know that if their previous lives, they may have been serving all sorts of Buddhas. Probably we all have. Maitreya Bandhu has something where he says, well, there's no such thing as a beginner. There is no such thing as a beginner. Most people have learned to meditate before. Most people have had some exposure to the Dharma before in some way or another. But more than that, people have a serious spiritual inclination, and they deserve respect for that. Otherwise, they wouldn't be there. Or even if they're not there, even if you just meet them on a bus, that is part of human nature itself. And to take people very, very seriously from that point of view. The way that Sangharakshita talks about it is he says, don't talk down to your audience. He says, whatever the age of one's audience, whatever the education, never talk down. Of course, you must, as I said earlier, be careful that you don't say things that go way above their heads. You can just say a few things, perhaps, that are beyond their understanding, just to suggest you don't and they don't understand everything about Buddhism. But the bulk of what you say must be serious and intelligible to them, and deal with fundamentals, and above all, not to be sort of talking down to them. And I've talked to Sangharakshita himself about his experiences in India, where he was dealing with people who may not have been able to read or write, who have spent long hours working in the textile industry in Mumbai, and he's speaking to them in the corridor of their tenement buildings. I've talked to him about teaching sex workers in Mumbai, and he was completely consistent in what he said. He never talked down. He used to use the most abstruse sort of Yogacharan philosophy in those situations, because he said everyone has got that potential. Everyone is actually a serious Dharma practitioner. You've got to treat people like that. And you can really see that now. We've got his complete works and his India, some of the the notes from his India talks. You can really see that he was completely consistent in what he talked about in India to what he talked about in the West, even though they're very, very different groups of people, because he never, ever talked down. He always saw the spiritual potential of every living being. So yes, Artacharya. And then there's Samanatata, which in this case could mean exemplification or congruency, that we're turning round the Dharma in our minds in all situations, with all communication. Whoever it's with and wherever we are, we become the Dharma. And we don't need to talk about what attainment we have or how far we've come, or we just need to talk about the Dharma and how that's permeating in our being, how that's kind of sinking into our being. And be congruent in that, so that the Dharma is a living force within us that we can then communicate to others. I think people are watching. That's what I mean, I do really love going and giving beginners classes in Brixton. Sometimes I just turn up without leading anything. And what I like about it is I want to see sort of where people are with the Dharma. You know, I find it very exciting that they're meeting the Dharma for the first time, but also, well, possibly not for the first time, but the first time in that collection of people. And I can see that people are very sincere, and they're watching what's happening. They're watching the interactions of the class. They're watching who you are. And I think what can happen, and I find this in the ordination process as well, and in the life of sharing in the life of the order, is that you've got two conversations happening. You've got the words that you're formulating and communicating, and you've got the body itself. And that sometimes you can be talking about quite ordinary things, even quite mundane things, but there's another communication that's happening at a completely different level, that is free of that, that's in a way kind of, I don't know, is it a shire? Is it our existential kind of longing and intention? Is it the depths of our being? Is it our kind of soul in a poetic sense communicating with each other? I'm not sure, but I definitely know there's another communication happening. And in fact, recently I wrote to someone, I said, oh, I was feeling that there were two conversations in that conversation. And I felt very, very deeply met, even though we were talking about families and holidays and what we were plans for Christmas. I felt deeply, deeply met. And I wrote to her from my solitary retreat, and she received that postcard and she said, yes, I felt the same too. It's wonderful. So yes, Dharma practice, I'll sum up now because I'm run over a little bit, but Dharma practice can't be contained. It has to be shared. It has to be shared on all levels, not just verbally, but even in the depths of our being. And in order to share it, we've got to take a deep dive into the Dharma itself and practice it deeply so that it shines out of the pores of our being. And we reflect on our practice and we share it out of love and gratitude. We take in who we're sharing it with so that there's a mutual communication. And we respect our own Dharma practice and the practice and potentialities of others and talk to their existential urge, talk to their beautiful motivation. And we're congruent with our Dharma practice and our communication of our Dharma practice throughout our lives. So the main thing is that we just get stuck in. We get stuck in and just make that attempt to share our Dharma practice, because it's a long journey and we will make mistakes. But in a sense, we've got no other option. And we've got no other option because it's in the nature of reality that one's experience is shared.